Hi, this is Matt Slepin, and welcome to Leading Voices in Real Estate. Today's episode is a revisit of my conversation with Phil Freelon, recorded back in 2017. Phil was an architect with Perkins and Will and one of the designers of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington, D.C. We spoke shortly after that museum was open. When we spoke, Phil was battling ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He passed back in 2019. A few weeks ago, back during the 4th of July holiday weekend, in deciding which episode in the archive to bring back, I thought immediately of this conversation with Phil. What should have been a feel-good, uniting celebration of our country's 250th, to be frank, felt hijacked by the craziness of our divisive politics, and the mall on which sits the museum that Phil designed, and this museum itself, was a through-line theme for some of that polarization. So to look back a bit to a time when the mall, the Smithsonian, this museum, and national celebrations like July 4th were national unifying treasures, we're bringing back this conversation with Phil. As always, I invite you to share this episode and others in the series with your friends and colleagues. If we can be helpful on the human capital side in your real estate enterprise and executive search, interim, embedded recruiting, or business platform advisory, assessments, or coaching, please contact me at mslepin@zrgpartners.com. I hope that you enjoy revisiting this conversation with Phil Freelon. Hi, this is Matt Slepin, host of Leading Voices with ULI, welcoming you to the latest installment of our podcast series. Today's conversation is with Phil Freelon, with whom I'd had the great pleasure to speak with for the podcast a few weeks ago. He was the founder of the Freelon Group, which became one of the largest African-American-owned architecture firms in the country, and which merged with Perkins and Will in 2014. Phil has spent most of his career focused on public architecture. Projects have included the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, Emancipation Park in Houston, multiple library projects, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, the recently completed Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and he is midstream on the Motown Museum. As we spoke about his work, what resonated for me was the word legacy, thinking about the meaning of the work he has created, his teaching and support for young Black architects and his family as well. I also had the opportunity this past weekend to visit his new museum at the Smithsonian and have the chance to observe American history through the lens of the African American experience. I will tell you that this was one of the most moving of the interviews I've had for Leading Voices. Hi, Phil. It's Matt Slepin.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing great, and it's a beautiful day in San Francisco, and you're in Durham today?
I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and it's a nice day here, too, after 3 or 4 straight days of rain, so we're happy to see the sunshine here.
A few headlines to orient our listeners. You grew up in Philly in a family with some deep history in the civil rights movement. You're an MIT-trained architect, and you've taught at North Carolina State University, Harvard, MIT, and many others. You're a Harvard Loeb Fellow, after which you started your own architecture firm in 1990, which expanded to become the largest African-American-owned architecture firm in the country. You've won many design awards and have really specialized in the public realm, which we'll talk about. And your signature design has been the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture that's on the National Mall. You were an Obama appointee to the National Commission of Fine Arts, and finally you joined forces with Perkins Will a couple years ago, so you're now part of one of the leading global design firms. There's a lot to talk about.
Yes.
I love to talk to people about kind of how they got started, where they came from, and maybe how that influenced the direction and path that they took. You grew up in Philly, which is my hometown. Talk about growing up.
Great. Yeah. Well, I grew up in a family surrounded by the arts, both performing arts, visual arts. My parents were in tune with all of that. And my grandfather, Alan Freelon Sr., was actually a noted painter during the Harlem Renaissance period. And if you look in books and libraries and study up on artists from that time period, you'll see Alan Freelon Sr. There. And so I remember visiting his studio and being encouraged after showing some talent in sketching and an interest in drawing and so forth, that my parents and particularly my grandfather encouraged that. And I always thought I would be an artist of some sort, maybe an industrial designer or a product designer, something like that. But when I got to high school, and if you're from Philadelphia, you may be familiar with Central High School, which is
Of course.
a public school, but one of the best in the country. It's selective and it draws from all over the city. And I was fortunate to be able to attend that school. My brother went there as well. My older brother, my father went there, and so Lou Kahn went there. and
Really? I think my dad went
yeah,
there, actually.
your dad
Small
may have
world.
gone there. So it was almost equivalent to a prep school education, but it was in the public schools, and they offered art classes and some design classes, drafting, and that's when I started to make the connection between the arts, the visual arts, and other things that interested me at the time, like mathematics and science, particularly physics and geometry. And those things together seemed to be a good blend of the arts and the sciences and the things that I not only enjoyed, but I excelled at in school. And so when I began to look into that at Central High School and taking the drafting courses and just sort of plowing through that in record speed, it occurred to me that I could do well in this field, not really knowing any architects, or my parents didn't know any architects, but we knew, in a way, like most people in general have a sense of what architects do, right? They design houses, they draw blueprints, quote unquote, they do these things.
Of course.
And so while I really didn't know much about it, I had a general sense. And when I got to architecture school, it turned out to be everything I had hoped for and more. I just continued to really be enthused and excited about a career in this field.
And it's interesting because most architects don't have the opportunity. Very, very, very few architects have the opportunity to work on the kinds of projects that you've worked on, where you're making an artistic statement in a huge way.
Well, I feel very fortunate in that regard, and it was an evolution to get there. It's not like I woke up one day and the Smithsonian called and I'm designing a museum. So I worked for 13 years for other firms and started my own firm in 1990 after the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard. And I was one person. It was one, then two, then 3, 5, 10, 20, up to about 65. And so it was a progression. And the type of work always followed my personal interests and also the experience I had gained working in other firms, doing schools and doing projects on colleges and universities, things that were associated with education and learning and sharing knowledge and being the buildings contributing to the vitality and growth of the community. So these were the types of projects I was drawn to, and over time, after being asked to do a library here and a cultural center there and an addition and things, there was a body of work that kind of drew me in the direction of where we headed some years later.
And then tell us about the Loeb Fellowship, and then did that help you make the leap to know that you had to or wanted to or had the capability of creating your own firm?
Well, it did, and as I mentioned, I'd worked for other firms, and I always advise interns and recent graduates to, get a variety of experiences, particularly in an urban setting, offices of different scales, firms that have different modes of practice, project types, and that's what I did. I worked for firms ranging from 2 or 3 people up to 500. I was in Houston, Texas, working at 3D International, a large firm there. I was the youngest associate in the firm at the time, in my 20s, and also working for a small firm in Durham that had about 5 people and everything in between. And so when I returned from Houston, I was recruited to come back and join a firm that was started by 2 people I had known from my school days. I had worked summers for a firm, and these guys had opened their own practice and kept track of me. So when I returned to North Carolina in 1982, that practice was about 35 people. And so 7 years later, when I took the Loeb Fellowship, that practice was 150 people. So I had the benefit and the experience of being part of that growth and being a partner there and a shareholder and vice president of architecture, which included 50 people. And that was just an incredible kind of development for a young person. And at the same time, I felt, disconnected from the design side, being more in management very early in my career and, hiring people and running an architecture practice in a larger AE firm. And that's when I decided to take a break and see if I could, be selected as a Loeb Fellow, a very competitive program. And I took a leave of absence to do the Loeb Fellowship in 1989, school year 89-90.
Right, which is a Harvard program.
Time away, that's a Harvard program for mid-career professionals, design professionals. So I came up through the design ranks. I mean, in this profession, you kind of find your own talent and niche, and those of us who are lucky enough to have some design skill are kind of channeled that way, and others may go into project management or construction administration or spec writing or detailing, project architect. There are all sorts of wonderful avenues for careers in architecture. And so, having been a designer, I was feeling anxious about getting back to doing that. Yet I had migrated to this management position. So the year I took off at Harvard was a chance to kind of take a deep breath. It was almost like a sabbatical from the profession, and able to, be there at the Graduate School of Design and the larger Harvard community and putting together an independent program of study and just kind of gathering myself and understanding what I might want to do with the rest of my career. And so somewhere midway through the fellowship, I decided that when I finished my commitment at Harvard in May of 1990, that I would, go off on my own. And it took some time, starting in January of that year, to disengage from the firm. There was stock involved. There was a non-compete clause and things of that nature that had to be worked through in order to do what I wanted to do. And it took time and some, a little bit of a struggle to make that happen.
And was your goal when you then formed your own firm, was that to get closer to design? Was it to focus on the kind of design that you love? Was it to grow a firm and be a leader of a firm, to pursue your own vision? Kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, all of those things. So I had a desire to build a firm in a certain way to align with my personal goals and values. And so when I mentioned this other firm I was with, well, I was by far the youngest partner, and I had ideas, and the two founders were always like, well, we're going to do it our way. And of course, they earned the right to run the firm the way they wanted to. And, they were in their mid-40s. They were going to be around for a while longer. And so I just had been, as I say, working for a while in different settings, and I had a notion about what I wanted to do. It was a little different from, let's say, a young person hanging their shingle out just after licensure. I really had the benefit of seeing different modes of practice, different size firms, different ways of going about things, things I wanted to emulate, things I wanted to maybe not emulate or copy. So, yes, it was all those things, including, being more closely associated with the design work, and also just moving in a direction where I felt like I could have a greater impact on the communities where I built work.
And if you look at the 24 years that you had your own firm, were those goals accomplished? And if you articulated on day one, and then you look back at 24 years and said, we've done this, we've approached it this way, did that exceed your vision?
Well, when you set goals, and I had a business plan and all that, the notion is you kind of refer back to it along the way and make adjustments. It's not like it goes in the file cabinet and then 25 years later you pull it out and say, did I make it or didn't I? So there were always sort of adjustments and refinements of that through, a strategic planning process, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, where, you reassess what you want to do and how you want to get there, and other people get involved, and you have partners, and, their ideas are great. You surround yourself with people that complement your skill set, and and together you begin to, steer the ship slightly, maybe in a slightly different course, and as you grow, and that's what happened. Now, I have had an occasion to look back at my business plan from 1990, and it was ambitious. It was funny. I thought I'd have, in 10 years, I'd have an office in Paris, and I'd be working internationally and all this. And of course, in 1990, the early part of that year, the economy was strong, but then the Gulf War hit in August of that year. And so there was a recession in
Right
the
away.
latter part of 1990 that lasted, half decade. So, you kind of roll with it and make the adjustments. And well, remember that with the economy the way it was, that was about the only kind of work that was available. When you hit a downturn in the national economy, the first thing that drives up is public sector work. The banks private sector work. The banks stop
Right.
loaning, developers go away. On the other hand, the funding cycles for state government, municipal governments, even the federal government, they have a lag to them. There are years that the private sector, the public sector, will continue on into a recession because those decisions were made years earlier, and the funds become available and kind of carry you through. So by choice, yes, but also by circumstance, we did a lot of public sector work, and it also was the sort of projects that were interesting to us for reasons that I mentioned. Improving communities, bringing better educational facilities online for public schools and colleges and universities and that sort of thing.
I want to talk about kind of big famous projects, but one thing that caught my eye is you've done a lot of library projects, and I'm curious, maybe as you started that and then as that work has matured, I'm so curious between the intersection between design and conceptualization, and over that period of time, what libraries were then, but what libraries are now. And I half understand what a library is. And maybe it's, in the largest part of it, maybe that it's a public space. Talk about that. I'm curious.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when the internet became more and more prominent, in the late 80s and early 90s, people were saying, well, who's going to need libraries when you can just go online and find what you want to know, and libraries are going to disappear. And what happened was the exact opposite. These neighborhood libraries became more important and became more similar to like a community center, and other services began to be important in those institutions, and they became a source of pride for their local communities. And let's face it, not everyone, even today, not everyone has a computer, and you can go to the library and get online and find a job and search for connections to different people. And when you don't have that facility or hardware at home, it has been really curious and fascinating to me to see how this notion of the neighborhood library, or even the city, central library, these things have become, hubs of activity and centers for community. And so we've designed quite a few of those here locally and around the country. And our library practice has expanded in recent years to include university libraries. And what we're seeing on these campuses is that the library is merging with the student center and becoming kind of the heartbeat of the campus. Let's face it, you go to college primarily to get an education, so it's all about learning. But the social experience and interaction with other students and faculty and staff is also a really important aspect of that part of our lives when we're in our late teens and early 20s. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that we see.
Yeah, it's an important civic institution that surprised me because I'd been outside of libraries for years and years, and then in some small communities wound up going into libraries, and then saw a hub of activity and arts and dance classes and yoga classes and music and sharing LPs. I guess there's no such thing as an LP, but sharing CDs and
videos and renting movies. And I think the public libraries have learned from places like Borders and what's the other one I'm thinking of? Um, the big bookstores.
Yeah, Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble, and Borders, and other places that have said, okay, people want to come, they want to sit down and open up a book. You don't always want to go online and be, just in your own little shell, but it's a social space, and people want to have a cup of coffee while they're doing it, and a Danish, and they want to grab a newspaper from a different city and read about that, and that whole social interaction piece of it becomes really important.
So let's talk about another one before the sexy ones. You were the designer of the Durham County Human Services Complex. My favorite part is the words between human services and complex, they fit together in some ways. And so I'm curious, how do you take those same concepts and humanize what may quickly feel, as I use the words, my voice dropped instead of went up.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make those places of engagement that's on a very positive note?
Well, the key word is human, and to understand that the people coming there are the most needy in their community. They can't afford to go to a doctor. They don't have health care insurance or dental coverage. They may need family counseling. And so all these social services in our county, Durham, had been decentralized in different buildings, and some of them in disrepair, and so if you were a family that had needed these services, you had to go from one place to another, get on the bus and ride again, and there are overlaps, because we wanted this facility to be welcoming, and for the people that work there to feel proud to go into it, and so architecture can really affect the mood and also lift the community. And I'll go back to the libraries and some of the places like Anacostia in Washington, D.C., where our library site was in the middle of a very depressed community. There was drug activity and other crime going on. And well, after this library was built, not a speck of graffiti, not the crime, no crime around there. They went somewhere else. People take pride in these civic institutions and take ownership. And the same with the Durham County Human Services Complex. We wanted somewhere that was welcoming, that was dignified, that gave people a sense of belonging to a community. We have a quote on the outside of the building, harkening back to the older days of architecture, where tablatures and votive walls would often have, words or quotes, and we did that, put a phrase about people being respected, and the health of every individual was important to their community. And I'm paraphrasing, and we wanted folks to feel, welcomed and comfortable. And there's a funny story associated with this, and I'll tell you.
Please.
I'm proud, and it also makes me chuckle. But as the building was opening, and maybe it was the second day it was open, but I was still there. I was looking at some details and punch list items, and a woman came in, and I overheard her saying to the security guard, she says, well, I found the museum, but where's the social services complex?
That's great.
Almost as if this couldn't be it. It's too beautiful, and it looks like a museum. And while that wasn't exactly intentional, it was consistent with the idea that this should be a beautiful place, and it's the state of North Carolina's largest LEED certified building, gold certified. It's a low scale building. It's only 4 stories, but it takes up an entire block. And so we've created this courtyard in the center to help with daylighting. And I'm very proud of that project. And when you put it in the context of not being as sexy as the others, I don't quite agree. I'm very proud of that. Also, the public bus station that we designed here in Durham. For the same reason, I wanted it to be, filled with light and beautiful. And it is, and people take care of it, and it doesn't look like an inner city bus station, and people treat it with respect and are happy to come into that light-filled space, and where most of these similar facilities in cities are dingy and places you wouldn't want to be seen or go to.
It's a fascinating question. It's a fascinating question in these times of cutbacks and not believing in government, or I don't know the right word for that, but if the civic institution feels right, looks right, and speaks to the best of us, it brings out the best of us. And you're the one who gets to translate that.
I believe that's true.
Have you ever been in the HUD building?
No. In D.C.?
In D.C. I'm not an architect, so I don't know the word. I think it's brutalist architecture, but
yes, brutalist. I know the building you're talking about. It's impressive.
It's an impressive building, and maybe if they had started the agency in a wonderful light-filled building that uplifted your hearts, maybe the agency would have had a better time over time within the world of government.
Well, and I believe that architecture can have a positive impact on people and the surroundings. Now, we don't want to place too much importance on buildings and materials and spaces. They have an impact, but I think it's a mistake to say that architecture can control or really, play a bigger part than it should. Nonetheless, people can be uplifted or depressed or any range of emotions based on how they feel in a space.
Well, that's what urban environments could do generally. And urban environments that you walk through that just lift your heart and has an excitement to it. And then the same ones that kind of get you down. And if you're going to spend money to create these places, it matters. So maybe that brings us to the Smithsonian project and A, how you won that, B, what was their intention, and C, what was your intention? What were you trying to accomplish, and talk about it.
Well, that project was a long time coming in every sense of the word for the nation, the Smithsonian. Our pursuit of it took quite a while. And I first learned about the possibility of a Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, around 2004, 2003 or 4, when President George W. Bush created a commission to study the possibility of this sort of museum there in the nation's capital. And I began to attend, I would go up once a quarter and participate and attend the commission meetings and getting to know some of the people on the commission, and with a dream of maybe one day having a possibly being involved in something like this. And I would see colleagues up there, Marshall Purnell, who's a prominent Washington, D.C. architect. His firm, Devereaux and Purnell, has done great work there. I would see Marshall. I would see Max Bond from New York. His firm, Davis Brody Bond, is very prominent there. And I knew these guys, and the architecture community is small to begin with, and those of us who are African Americans, it's even a smaller slice, and we can talk more about that later. But Max and I knew that somewhere along the way we were going to compete for this, and we got to talking and had the notion that maybe we should team up and join forces to go after this project. And that's what we did. We formed an informal alliance called Freelon Bond. And, we were, thinking about the competition and how others would be entering the fray, and, from international firms to domestic firms and all the star architects, and everyone would certainly be pursuing this. And we knew about David Auger and the young Tanzanian-born British architect. And we were wondering, what is he going to do? And around that time, David called us and wanted to meet. We said, wow, this is interesting. Our team is already set, but let's talk to them and see what comes of it. So I flew to New York, and Max and I met with David. Wanted to kind of feel him out, see what kind of guy we neither of us had met him personally. We knew him by reputation. And we talked about our various approaches to design and philosophy, and what was important to us in our process. And it turned out there was a lot of alignment with our thinking about architecture and design. And personality-wise, we found David to be a nice guy. You never know with architects, right? But he was down to earth. He was collaborative, and that was a really good sign. And we said, well, let's expand the team, and became Freelon AG Bond. And then later the Smith Group was added because they were in D.C. and they had a long-standing relationship with the Smithsonian. So our team, kind of evolved organically over time. And we didn't sit down one day and say, let's get 4 architects together, but it kind of unfolded that way. And it turned out to be a really good collaborative team to work with. And I guess the results are apparent. We've had a lot of success, and the building is magnificent. I mean, that may sound self-serving, but we're very proud of what was accomplished with that team.
You should be. I haven't been inside. But I've walked by and my jaw dropped. I didn't know there was going to be a building at that unbelievable location next to the Washington Monument. But then when I saw the materials and the shape, it just blew me away. And then the closer I got, the more I wanted to feel and see it, and it was very welcoming. But I didn't get to go in, so I don't know it was open when I was there. Talk about that. So talk about the feeling of it. Talk about your goal. What do you want to accomplish, and how that was in concert with the vision that the Smithsonian had for the museum from the beginning.
Right. My approach to cultural institutions like museums that have maybe a theme to them or have a root in culture or history, my approach has always been to try and design a building that expresses the mission and vision of the institution in some way and contributes to the storytelling, so that the museum isn't simply an enclosure around exhibits or galleries, that the architecture itself is participating in that storytelling, and there is a purpose beyond the shape and the materials. And that's even from the smallest project to the biggest, that's been a consistent notion of ours. And I'm not sure that's totally unique in architecture, but it's something certainly I've been advocating my whole career. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we wanted to, particularly in a competition setting, we wanted the building to be expressive of its purpose and its origins. And as we began thinking about this, and one of the challenges of competition, as opposed to a direct selection and working with the client as you develop ideas, is that you have to kind of dream up something and develop an idea in a vacuum. You don't get to interact in real time with the client and with the user groups, and have the kind of stakeholder meetings that we typically have to find out what the community thinks, and to include a broader group of interested parties in the design. So that means we had to kind of develop something on our own that we would hope would resonate with the Smithsonian and the decision makers. The selection panel that was put together, which included journalists and educators, obviously museum professionals, architects, and others. And so we knew that this was obviously an African American museum, and there's an African component to that term, African American. There's certainly the American aspect of it. So we wanted something that had harkened back a bit to the motherland, Africa, but also something that spoke to where we are, our time and place now and historically, and looking into the future.
As an African American man, it must be a dream to be able to accomplish a building like that, to be that deeply involved in this monument.
It's been a real honor and a privilege to work on this. And I feel like I was born to be involved, to have this role. It came along at a point in my career when I was ready, I was prepared, I was capable, and had the expertise and experience to do it. And you could say I was very lucky. But I agree with the person that said luck is the intersection of preparedness and opportunity. So I recognize the opportunity, and I was prepared to try and execute.
Absolutely true. So we've talked a lot about kind of your firm. We've talked a lot about being an African American architect. I think 2% of the architects in the country are Black. Talk about what that means and your leadership and scholarship and support of growing that.
Yes, and I mentioned earlier that the architecture profession itself is kind of small, and so it's not unusual for someone like me to say, I became an architect, but I didn't know one growing up. My parents didn't know any architects, and when you think about the profession as a whole, there are only about 125,000 licensed architects in the U.S. Now you compare that with attorneys, there are over 1 million attorneys in the U.S. Physicians, 800,000. Okay, so the profession itself is small. It's small, and then within that very tiny profession, you've got a small sliver of 2% are African American. So chances are, if you're a young kid growing up, particularly an African American, you may not know or see or understand anything about architecture or know anybody that looks like you who's doing it. And I was just fortunate to learn about it and be in the right place at the right time. I talked about Central High School and the opportunities there, and going on to architecture school and growing and thriving in that environment. And so what I'm trying to do, and I've been working on this my whole career, is to raise the visibility of what we do, so that hopefully young children can see that and say, geez, that looks like fun. I'd like to do that. And guess what? It is fun. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's just a tremendous career, and I want to bring more people into it. When I look at other art forms, and I do consider architecture art, when I look at music and I look at dance and I look at theater and I see the impact that African Americans have had on those art forms, it's been transformational. It's been seismic, the impact. Now, just imagine where's our Miles Davis or where's our Alvin Ailey? We haven't seen
right
that
here
yet.
On the phone.
Well, I don't know. The point is, there's a tremendous talent base that we're missing out on. Forget about the opportunities, and that's important. Every child should have an opportunity to excel and do what they love. And so it's important for those individuals, but I think it's even more important for the world to tap into, a source of talent that has been, just sitting there, and we haven't availed ourselves of it.
Right.
Because part of it is architecture has a discipline, as a curriculum is very prescriptive. You just can't go to college and decide after a few years you want to major in architecture. You have to know that. You have to get accepted in an accredited architecture program. Most often the standards are higher than the normal university standards. And then it's a rigorous 5 years at least, and sometimes 6 or 7, to just get through and graduate with a professional degree. And you're still not an architect. You've got to there's an internship, which is 2 or 3 years at least, and then there's an exam. So the whole process is difficult. And when you consider the fact that you don't even know about it, and this awareness issue that I mentioned, it's no wonder there aren't more. But I challenge us, and I include myself, the architecture profession, to do something about that, right? And so, we're sponsoring a scholarship at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. You can approach it from that end of things, and just as importantly, maybe more so, go into the schools, starting at elementary school and middle school, and talk about architecture and design and landscape, and get youngsters who may have an inclination to be interested in this, get them fired up about it and thinking about it, so that when they get to high school and it's time to think about college, they know that there's a path you have to take if you want to be an architect. Many minority students don't have the resources to say, go through 4 years of history major and then decide, oh, you know what, I think I'll go back to grad school, get a master's of architecture. Sure, why not? Thanks, Mom and Dad.
Of course.
No, that's not possible for everyone. So it's about awareness, and we're trying to do all we can to raise that awareness so that people know, youngsters, that this is something that they can do. You will be what you see, and if they don't see it, if all they see is what's on television, and that people believe being a rap star or an athlete are the only paths to success, that's a myth. That's a lie.
We've talked a little bit about challenges and headwinds in our conversation, and you have a big one. You were diagnosed with ALS recently, and you're not slowing down. So talk about that and talk about how you hold that and how you move forward both in business and elsewhere.
Sure. Well, it was about 18 months ago, the fall of 2015. I began to notice difficulty in my normal routine, running and going to the gym and trying to keep fit, and I was feeling like those things were more difficult. I was running the same distances but more slowly, and just sort of feeling out of sorts, and knew something was wrong. And I began that winter to, obviously you go to your doctor, and they send you to specialists, and you go to the orthopedic surgeon, and you go to the neurologist, and people trying to figure this out. And finally, I ended up at Duke University in their neurology department. I kept being referred from one to the next, and I was kind of the last stop. And that's when the diagnosis was shared with me and my family. Obviously it was a shock. It was a huge disappointment. And, we struggled with that and are still struggling. My mobility slowly is less and less, and it's harder to move around. But it affects different people in different ways. And in some cases, your speech is affected almost immediately, and you can't breathe and can't swallow. And, that particular version of the disease progresses very quickly. For people like me, it can begin in the lower half of your body or in one leg, and that seems to be a slower progression in most cases. And so, in speaking with my family and my wife about it, we decided that rather than retreat and pretend nothing is wrong and just sort of fade out of sight, we wanted to, first of all, continue to do the work that was important to me and to us, and secondly, to maybe raise some awareness. Is that word again, awareness? Where there are other people like me who need the kind of treatment and could benefit from research toward finding a cure for the disease, which there is no cure. It was a combination of wanting to stay active, and quite frankly, that's the best thing for my physical and mental health, but also wanting to take some steps to use the heightened visibility of myself and my wife to bring awareness to this issue of ALS and try and raise some money. And that's what we've been doing. It's interesting, in the summer of that year I was diagnosed, last July 2016, I decided to take a month off and just sort of gather myself, figure out what I was going to do, and I got worse. I got sick. And when I went back to work on August 1, all of a sudden I got better. So
not a surprise.
That coming to work and doing meaningful work and contributing to these projects that are helping people, feeds my spirit in a way that I think has a positive impact on the physical constitution as well.
I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember, if you're enjoying Leading Voices, to share an episode with a friend or get them to subscribe. If they're podcast wary and not sure how to find and subscribe on their phone, go ahead and take their phone in your hand and subscribe for them. And add another few of your favorite podcasts to their list to get them started. They'll thank you for it. You can also find episodes of the show on our website, which you can find at zrgpartners.com/leadingvoices. And if you have comments or discussion about this episode or Leading Voices in general, or if you're seeking help in real estate human capital solutions, recruiting or consulting especially, please contact me at mslepin@zrgpartners.com. Thanks for being a listener to Leading Voices.